In this video, we shall be looking at how to name acids. Now, to name acid, you must first of all know your polyatomic ions. Here are some examples of polyatomic ions. This is known as sulfate. This is known as sulfite. This is known as sulfide. Now, if you pay close attention, sulfate has more oxygen than sulfide, and then sulfide, the one that ends with IDE, is usually a monoatomic ion. It does not contain oxygen. While sulfite, the one that ends with ITE, has less oxygen compared to sulfate, the one that has more oxygen. So you just need to memorize these polyatomic ions. It will be very helpful when you are dealing with questions like naming acids. Now, I want us to look at some rules that are involved in naming acids. When naming acids, if the acid contains a polyatomic ion which ends with ATE, as in the case of phosphate, you will replace this ATE, IC, and then you add acid. Right? Whereas if an acid contains a polyatomic ion which ends with ITE, as in the case of phosphite, then you replace the ITE with OUS and then you add acid. If the acid contains a monoatomic ion who ends with IDE, then you first of all add a prefix of hydro, then you replace this IDE with a suffix of IC, then you add acid. So now let's take some few examples. How do you name this particular acid? H2SO4. Now, to name this particular acid, we first of all identify the polyatomic ion in this acid. Now, we know that this acid has a polyatomic ion SO4 2-. Now, SO4 2- is known as sulfate. From our rules, we say that if an acid contains a polyatomic ion with the end in ATE, 8, you drop this ATE, replace it with IC, and then you add acid. So therefore, we say the naming of this particular compound is going to be, you put sulfur first, then you drop that ATE, you make it IC, then you add acid. So it becomes sulfuric acid. Next, let's say we have an acid H2SO3. How do you name this particular acid? First of all, let's identify the polyatomic ions or the ions in this acid. And in this acid, the ions we have is SO3 2-. Now, the name of this particular ion is sulfide. Now, from our rules, when the ion ends with ITE, we would replace it with OUS and then add acid. So we'll first bring the name sulfur, then OUS, then we'll add acid. And by the way, if you are wondering how you are going to be able to identify the polyatomic ion or the monoatomic ion in acid compound, you remove all the hydrogen atoms in the acidic compound. All that will be left to be the atomic ions, which could be polyatomic or monoatomic. Now, for the sign that is up here is the number of hydrogen you have. So if you have 4 hydrogen here will become 4-. If you have 3, it will become 3-. So what if you have H2S? How do you name this particular acid? So first of all, let's separate the monoatomic ion in this acid, and we have just S2-. Now we know S2- to be sulfide. Now we have IDE at the ending, and based on our rules, we will first of all add a prefix of hydro, but we'll drop the IDE and replace it with IC. Then we'll add acid. So it becomes hydrosulfuric acid. So what if we have an acid HClO4? How do we name this particular acid? First of all, let's write down the polyatomic ion in this acid. So we have the polyatomic ion to be ClO4-1. Now we know that this polyatomic ion is named perchlorate. Now it ends with ATE. Therefore, replace the ATE, perchlorate. So we'll replace the AT with IC, then we'll add acid. So it becomes perchloric acid. So what if we have HNO3? For HNO3, we first identify the polyatomic ion. So here we have NO3-. And we know NO3 is known as nitrate. And nitrate ends with ATE. Now, based on the rules we just looked at earlier, we replace the ATE with IC. So this will become IC. Then we'll add acid. So it becomes nitric acid. So what if we have HNO2? Now in this case, we still go by our rules. We identify first the polyatomic or monoatomic ion in the acid, and in this case we have NO2-. NO2 is known as nitrate. Now nitrate ends with ITE. Now based on the rules, we are going to replace ITE with OUS and then we'll add acid. So it becomes nitrous acid, HI. Now to name this particular acid, we first separate the monatomic ion in this acid. So we have iodide and it's a monatomic ion ending with IDE. Now based on the rules, we first add a prefix of hydro. Then we'll drop this IDE and replace it with IC. Then we'll add acid. So we have hydroiodic acid. So if we have an acid compound, now to name this particular compound, we first identify the polyatomic ion. So when we identify this polyatomic ion, so the name of this polyatomic ion is acetate. Now replace this ATE with IC and then you add acid. So you have it becomes acetic acid. Now I want us to look at how to write the formula of an acid if you are given the name of the acid. So maybe in a question you are given the name of an acid and you are asked to write the formula. Let's take for example, you are given phosphoric acid and you are asked to write the formula of this particular acid. How do you go about it? First, you look for the polyatomic ion associated with phosphoric acid. Now, the polyatomic ion associated with phosphoric acid is known as phosphate. Since there is no hydro at the beginning of the name, you already know that it's not a monoatomic ion. So now, since we have -3 as a charge, we need to add 3 hydrogen so that we can neutralize it. Therefore, we'll have the formula to be H3PO4. Let's say you are given phosphorus acid. Now, maybe you want to identify the polyatomic ion associated with the acid. Now, here they say phosphoric acid. So you see phosphorus and then you just see IC and then acid. So you know this is a polyatomic ion because it doesn't have hydro at the beginning. And then it ends with 8 because it has just IC and acid. Now, let's say you are given phosphorus acid. Now in this case it ends with OUS. So you know that it is the ITE. So in this case, the polyatomic ion associated with it, since it does not have hydro at the beginning, is PO3 3-. Now to neutralize this particular compound, you add 3 hydrogen to neutralize it because we have 3 charge. So we have H3PO3 3-. That is how to write the formula of this particular compound. Now, what if you have a compound carbonic acid? How do you write this particular compound? Now we first identify the polyatomic ion associated with this particular compound. We have CO3 2-. And CO3 2- is known as carbonate. Carbonate ends with ATE. To neutralize this particular polyatomic ion, you add 2 hydrogen at the end. So we have H2CO3. So this is how to write the name of this particular compound. So let's say we have a compound hydrobromic acid. Now, since we have hydro at the beginning of the name, we have it in the back of our mind that this particular acid contains a monatomic ion. So when naming it, we identify the monatomic ion involved associated with this particular acid. And in this case, we have Br-1, which is bromide. Now, to write the formula of this acid, we put down the number of hydrogen that is equivalent to the charge to neutralize the charge. So in this case, we have hydrobromic acid. So this is how to write the formula. So there are some few cases where you have hydro and yet it's not a monoatomic ion. A good example is question like hydrocyanic acid. Identifying the polyatomic ions involved because cyanic is not a monoatomic ion. We have Cn-. Now the name is cyanide. It ends with IDE. So we have cyanide. So this particular polyatomic ion has the name cyanide ending with IDE. So it still obeys the rules. Now to write the formula of this particular acid, that I had the number of hydrogen that's equivalent to the number of charge to neutralize this particular charge. So we say HCN, which becomes hydrocyanic acid. So this is how to write the formula. And in this case, we have hydro, yet it is not a monoatomic ion. So that will be all for this video. Please like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching.